morning that clearly we're living in a world where we're bombarded with new technologies, we're bombarded by new trends, and how do organizations recognize potentially disruptive innovation that might affect their business models. Here to discuss how we can how we can spot what's relevant and integrate these things into our businesses. Please welcome the person responsible for overseeing all aspects of Accenture's strategy, innovation and investment, Omar Abbosh.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here with you today. I was born in Baghdad in Iraq, so that, I guess, makes me an immigrant. And in my wildest imagination, I would never, ever have expected bringing my desert-tuned DNA into this rather cool environment in front of the wide audience today. But I'd like to talk to you a little bit about human imagination. So I don't know how many people in the room have seen this movie from a while ago, Gattaca. It's quite good. So this movie was about eugenics, where your class in society was determined by your genes. And if you were Ethan Hawke, that was really bad. And if you were Jude Law, that was really good. And it was a good space romp as well. Today we have something called CRISPR technology, which I'm sure many of you in the room are familiar with. But CRISPR for me is a very big deal, and I know that we're going to hear a lot more about it in the coming years. It's a gene editing technology. So what happens is you can go into a gene sequence, take out some of the codes, and replace them with different ones. Today you have developers in MIT writing software code where the output actually is a segment of DNA that they can place in a virus and use that virus to infect an organism. And you can look at that for treating fungal infections on wheats. You can look at it for congenital blindness and all sorts of other aspirations, some maybe more nefarious. How is this possible? Well, when we sequenced the first human genome in the year 2000, it cost $2.7 billion. Today it costs about $800. And right now my nanny can take a saliva swab, send it to 23andMe for £150 and find out about her genetic antecedents and her risk factors. And just for clarity, when I say my nanny, it's not my nanny, it's children. Hands up if you've seen these movies. Anyone remember these ones? So these movies with robots and droids and all other fun things. Robots actually, while there's been a tremendous work done on them for many decades actually, they're quite dumb historically, our robots. They work within very narrow tolerances, they fall over really easily. If you change the environment around them, they don't work very effectively at all. However, Boston Dynamics is a company that has just changed hands from Google to SoftBank. If you look at their Handle robot, which I encourage you to do, this thing travels at speed on cambers with snow and ice. It can carry heavy loads. It can jump over obstacles, and it can do this completely untethered and unbeaconed. I mean, it's an amazing progress where you combine machine learning technology with robotics, and suddenly these things become much more agile and capable than we've ever seen them before. And I think we're going to see a dramatic pervasiveness increase of these sorts of technologies in many different episodes. Method 2 out of South Korea, again, how you enhance the human to do much more, again, is a very interesting technology that we see. Knight Rider, for those of you who are old enough, was this annoying guy, Hoff, who would call up his car, the kit, to come and save him because he kept digging himself into impossible situations for no reason whatsoever. But then the car would autonomously come and save him. So of course you can get your autonomous vehicle today to come and get you out of any circumstances. There's a Nissan Nismo with your Apple Watch or whatever other wearable you're wearing, and we see these technologies moving apace. Has anyone seen this movie, Her? So this is a movie about artificial intelligence. We've heard that in numerous contexts so far this morning. The thing about AI is normally it's trying to kill us, as you know, in the Terminator and Ex Machina and so on. That wasn't the case in this movie. In this movie, he falls in love with his operating system because she displayed listening skills and empathy, which apparently are not always common in all relationships. And you heard Lisa before talking about, where is all this investment in artificial emotional intelligence going? And where does it actually lead? So people will say, look, AI is for automative, repetitive, mundane tasks. That can be very powerful. Can it really replicate or in any way simulate human behaviors? And the answer is, well, we don't know for sure. However, when an intelligence agency trains an infrared camera on your face, looking at subcutaneous blood flows, and uses machine learning to tell whether or not you're lying in a modern version of the polygraph, that is curious. When autonomous car software developers are training cameras on drivers' faces to look at their emotional state to figure out whether or not it's safe to return control back to the human while they're driving along. I mean, I find that very intriguing in terms of where all these things are headed. And everyone's familiar with this? I mean, there's probably, most of you have one at home. This is the Amazon Echo. Again, if you said like just 2 years ago, not even 3 years ago, the dominant form of interacting with the internet was the smartphone scrolling and tapping. Today, millions of people are talking to the internet. And you're seeing a progression of this natural language technology that is really amazing. I mean, there's a company called Viv that I encourage you to look at, where you can dial into Viv and say, hey Viv, is it going to be sunny, or what temperature will it be after 5 p.m. on Saturday in a particular area? And the code will take that sentence and break it down into pieces and then automatically generate different queries on the internet to serve up an answer in near real time. So our ability to interact with the internet through voice is for sure going to become a much more dominant feature. The guys who code Alexa today are now coding in ums and ahs in the code so that it's slightly less automaton-like in the interactions with you. Sophia from Hanson Robotics over here on the left, if you touch her skin, it feels like skin. And she's got 40 motors and actuators behind her face that move and respond to display some kind of emotion that a human would recognize. Maybe erroneously, as we heard from Lisa earlier, but would recognize as something that they get in conversation and dialogue. And again, just go and have a look at Sophia Awakens on YouTube and see what you think. So these are all things that I find very stimulating to say, well, all right, what does this mean in our society and in business for what we need to consider? Total Recall. This one is a super complex plot. This is the original version of the movie where Arnie Schwarzenegger didn't know if he was a good guy or a bad guy. He was dealing with memory implants. He was dealing with the real bad guy who was trying to terraform and control the atmosphere on Mars for the purpose of resource exploitation. So, of course, today we also have our modern-day bad guy. It's this guy, Elon Musk, who, as you probably know, has got SpaceX. And if I said to you 20 years ago, we're going to put payloads in space using only commercial finance, no government backing whatsoever, you'd have said no ways. But that's indeed what these guys are doing. And they've got billions of dollars from NASA putting payloads in space, formed only through private capital. So now, when Elon talks about Mars, he's very serious. And in fact, he says he actually wants to die on Mars, which I'm certain he doesn't mean on impact, because apparently it's really hard to slow down, when you've got no atmosphere. But also his latest venture, Neuralink, is something that, again, I'd encourage you to have a look at. This is about putting tiny implants in our neocortex to understand at a close to neuron level exactly what's going on. Now, I don't want to, Accenture is a very here and now kind of business, so I'm not thinking too far out, but when people talk about the fusion of human intelligence with machine intelligence and where that leads us, some of where this guy is headed is certainly trying to test the boundaries on these things. So these things that we imagined were sci-fi not so long ago, we're close to creating them. So, the thesis says, well, okay, if you can imagine it, you can almost create it. Where does that lead us? And actually, what's underpinning this? And a lot of my clients ask me, what's going on? And what's actually going on underneath it is a logarithmic reduction in cost of all these technologies, not just in the ICT space, but in all the others. So, the autonomous car in 2009, the cost of the LiDAR on top of that Google smart car was $30,000. And all the auto manufacturers said, look, there's no ways that can be commercialized. By 2014, that cost $80, that same kit. The smartphone that you're carrying in 2007, the cost of the components were about $500. And just a few years later, the cost was $10. And in 2007, you'd be delighted to have any camera, and now you want 12 megabits on the front and the back. The point is whether it's drones, robots, genomics, material science, IT, we're seeing a logarithmic reduction in cost enabled by the flow of information. And I haven't yet found an industry that doesn't have information flowing. And it's this logarithmic reduction in cost that allows you to upend an industry. And so when we look at the cost of things like photovoltaic, solar cells, electric vehicle battery packs from the year 2000 to now, this is 2007, they've gone down more radically than cloud storage, which is much talked about. And so those sorts of economic changes are what, of course, upend an industry. And so that brings us on to the subject of disruption. So where does disruption come from? Well, it comes from all these new innovations fueled by logarithmic cost reduction bumping into an existing business model. And existing business models struggle to adapt fast to this rapid change. And so when I say disruption, a lot of people will think of the logos that you see here on the chart. And I'm always curious about, when Blockbuster was given the opportunity to invest in Netflix, what were they thinking? When Kodak were patenting digital photography and Nokia were patenting aspects of the smartphone technology, what were they thinking as well? And how did this disruption occur? So sometimes disruption is just really fast. And Google Maps meeting TomTom, it's just really hard to sort of solve your way out of that one. But this sort of explosive disruption, it turns out, is not the most common form of disruption at all. These are the sort of the flagship cases that everyone can rattle off. The much more common form of disruption is what we call compressive disruption. And I'll put to you today that pretty much every one of the world's biggest established industries, whether it's banking, insurance, oil and gas, telecoms, industrial equipment, they're all suffering what we call compressive disruption, which can be arising from a combination of features. It can arise from the Amazon or the Huawei wolf at the door in a particular sector, retail and telecoms equipment. It can arise from the attack of the ants, the fintech players nibbling away at pieces of margin in the value chain of a bank. But what we see in all of these industries is that the revenues have either increased with no addition of EBIT dollars, or the revenues start to flatline and the EBIT dollars start to come down. Why is that a big deal? Well, and it is a big deal because your investment capacity is declining. And to get from a core business of today to the new business of tomorrow that's fueled by all those innovations that we just looked at requires massive investment. And when compressive disruption takes hold of an industry, it starts to squeeze the investment capacity of a company over time. And the reason the management don't always react is because actually when they look around them in the sector, every other management team is suffering exactly the same thing. And this thing plays out over a longer duration than the typical cycle of a management team. And certainly for our business, speaking for a big company that is just as susceptible to all these disruptive effects as anyone else, we think hard about, well, what do you do? And in fact, what can companies do to make sure that the innovation that's out there with the logarithmic cost reduction doesn't disrupt the heck out of the business? So of course, a lot of companies say, well, the answer is digital. We're going to take all these digital technologies and we're going to make them pervasive in our business. So I asked the Accenture research team to say, hey, can you go and look at we look at 117 different factors of digital intensity of a company, look at several hundred companies over time, and say, how does that correlate with their financial performance? And so I was, of course, completely revolted to discover zero correlation at all between the digital intensity of companies and their financial performance overall. And it was a problem for us because we've gone and firmly nailed our colors to the mast of digital as a company. But it turns out the story is a bit more involved. When you plot all the companies and understand what's going on, you find a zone of companies, the 18% there, who are actually very digitally intensive, but not delivering financial performance against all the metrics, but delivering higher profit margins than their industry peers. In other words, they're using digital to automate their existing business models, which of course increases investment capacity and allows them to drive that business forward. However, it's not yet being recognized by financial markets in metrics like total returns to shareholders. Then you have the guys in the bottom right quadrant here, the business leaders, who actually are just very good business runners. They manage costs tightly, they squeeze the business, they do capital allocation, they do portfolio management. They're not especially focused on digital, and they do deliver overall very good financial results. But the bit that was curious is that the top right quadrant surpassed them materially on overall total returns to shareholders in aggregate. So in other words, the companies that were mastering digital, not just to transform their existing business model and essentially automate what they currently do, but use digital to discover new revenue streams and new revenue models, were the ones that were breaking out from the pack. And so those are the ones that we wanted to study and make sure we understand what is it they're actually doing. And it turns out they do 4 things concurrently. They apply digital to transform the core business, cut costs, be competitive, be more agile. They grow the core business using techniques in the digital arena, like personalization. You've heard a lot about digital marketing in this forum many times, but where we see personalization going today is it's going way beyond marketing. It's how do I convince you to send me a strand of your hair so I can tailor make your shampoo and send that to you? Or how do I sequence your DNA so I can tailor make the medicines for you? That level of personalization is what we're seeing leading companies do today. And then scaling the new is the super difficult bit. Every CEO I speak to has been to Silicon Valley. They've found the new that's relevant in their sector. The issue is they can't scale it. And what everyone's running around is saying, let's build proof of concepts, let's build MVPs. But that's actually relatively straightforward. It's super difficult to get an MVP into 3,000 stores and make it work. And so the companies that master that scaling the new is where we see a major shift. And then the last bit is the wise pivot. How do you manage capital allocation and investment management in time between your core business and your new business over time to drive that focus? And when Microsoft go and say, look, we were not the place that attracted the best software developers. We take a $7.6 billion write-down on hardware. We invest massively in LinkedIn. And then suddenly we become a cloud and platform company. That's a company that's making a big shift. By the way, the logos on this chart are not endorsements of a company, but they are endorsements of a piece of a strategy of a company that I can get into. Just sort of bringing it a little bit closer to home, as I mentioned, in our company, we feel very responsible for, we have 425,000 people. We need to make sure that they have a fruitful and exciting and great career, but we're also susceptible to disruption. So while we're working on all aspects of what you see around this little wheel here, we're also thinking hard about, in the new era, what does all this innovation mean? Because it has major implications for things like jobs, careers, the nature of work in the future. So we spend an enormous amount of time thinking about the nature of responsibility as a company. And so I'd just like to sort of pick out a couple of examples. The human at the center, every technology we work on or create, we think about as for people. The purpose of technology is for us, it's not the other way around. We have a movement in Accenture called Truly Human, which is all about how do you recognize the whole person at work and encourage people to bring their whole self to work, not just a narrow box narrowly defined in terms of how we want it. And that shows up in things like our inclusion starts with I approach. It's in our conduct counts, where we hold ourselves super accountable as best as we possibly can for how we behave with one another at work. But in the areas of technology, let's say we're working on applying Google machine learning APIs in a particular client context. We've got a set of design principles about what does responsible AI look like. How do you build explainability into the algorithms? How do you take bias out of the data sets? Those are core parts of how we're trying to operate and move our company over time. And the innovation ecosystem, again, is a recognition that no one big company has got any chance at all of mastering innovation. All those innovations that I spoke to you about earlier are always happening in small companies by definition, because corporates and big companies have a cost of capital that is too low to afford the risk of failure. And so what we do is we work through Accenture Ventures, Accenture Labs with groups in the wider ecosystem of startups to make sure we find ways of bringing their innovation technology onto a bigger scale and into bigger markets. So to summarize, we imagined it and we thought it was sci-fi, but actually it's really here today. When these new innovations that we've created today bump into existing business model, they do cause disruption, and companies struggle with that because they're glued to their existing core business models. We're glued to it because of our leadership mindsets, because of how our budgets and our expenses are oriented today to feed and fuel the existing revenues coming out of the core business. And so the question is, how do you then get from that to the new? But the thing is all these innovations I spoke about are mainly free, available on open source. They're certainly available at very low cost on the cloud stack technologies that you can access. You can, I'm sure, have an interesting conversation about IP and who owns data and so on, but that innovation is out there. And the steps of how to get from the core to new, I think, are well understood. So the question is what's the heart of it all? And so I'm running around the place and talking to clients all over the world. What I can tell you is the secret of the companies that make this rotation from the core to the new is it all boils down to CEO courage. It boils down to the bravery of the top team to really change who they are. But with innovation and courage, you can achieve anything. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Omar.
Thank you.
Quick question. A lot of the organisations you're dealing with are absolutely enormous, and they have shareholders, and they have quarterly earnings reports. How do they get to a place where digital transformation, where they, the CEO has to make announcements about, their quarterly earnings, whatever? How do they get to a place where they're comfortable with change and with taking fundamentally a long-term view rather than this just view about, quarterly earnings reports?
Yeah, I worry about that a lot. And when we talk about the wise pivot with our clients, what we found in technology services, so our space, is that when your revenues in the new business exceed about 10%, investors pay attention. When you're below 10%, actually it's very hard to get them to pay attention. So the story you tell investors, how you explain to investors why this is an existential necessity, I think is a core part of it. I think today you've got something like $83 trillion of assets under management. About 25% of them today are classed as socially responsible. So there are increasing groups of investors out there who want to see companies do the right thing, if you like. So how corporate leadership tell their story, help them understand the absolute long-run necessity of these things, if that company is going to be around, is, I think, a key part of it. But below 10%, it's hard. So you've got to work it.
So, and you're going into organisations, and they're obviously at the beginning of a process. For people in this room who are maybe thinking about how they transform their own businesses and how they kind of deal with these kind of disruptive threats, when you go in, what is the first thing you tell people in terms of this is what you need to do tomorrow?
I mean, honestly, the answer is we try very hard not to tell anyone anything.
Sure.
And start by asking some questions to understand much better, what the context is. I think, advisory services, maybe, people say, well, like, these are experts, they've got to come and tell us how to do things. In general, every client, every company is different, their situation is different. So I always begin with diagnosing and then co-creating and co-developing solutions with clients. I think when you impose an idea on a company, it may well not stick. However, if they create it with you, then it's much more likely to
All right.
last.
Omar, many thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.